Hi, this is Gene Preuss. Today I want to talk a little bit about your unit assignment. Your writing assignment is a 2 to 3 page essay that you're going to get information from both the textbook and from your study guide and other information. Let's look quickly at Blackboard. If we go in here and log on to Blackboard, we'll see in our Unit 1 that there's a study guide, the unit question rubric, and the Unit 1 question. If we look first at the study guide, here is how it can help you. The study guide has information over the chapters in the unit, questions you should be able to answer whenever you get to the question assignment. There are some things that you should know. First of all, at the question assignment, it asks you a question that you must answer. This is your assignment. So this question asks you to take a stand. Do these images accurately reflect the attitudes Americans held about the poor and minority groups during the late 19th century? So it's a yes or no question. So you're going to say yes or no, and then you're going to back up what you answer with evidence from both the text and the sources. Here you have the general paper guidelines. This tells you what I'm looking for whenever I grade your paper. And here you have the sources. You'll note there are a variety of sources with their titles. These come mostly from your textbook, but there's also sources from other locations. Here you'll find your essay rubric. This is the rubric I use when I grade your paper. There's also a copy of this on turnitin.com, so whenever you turn it in, I will grade according to this rubric. So let's look at a brief overview of this unit. Now this is going to be a little bit longer presentation than normal. I normally won't go this far, but since this is the first time you're going to do the unit question, I wanted to really prepare you for this. If we look at the various units we're going to cover here, we're covering 5 units this first week. That's a lot, but I think you can go through this fairly quickly. If we look at Chapter 14, Now That We Are Free, the point as introduced by this painting that's at the very beginning is that there's a new world order. Things have changed in the South. The relationship between African Americans and white Americans has changed dramatically. And that's what this painting is supposed to represent. And if we look at the time period, historians call this the Reconstruction period. We also call the South after the Civil War the New South. So let's look and see how things changed. First of all, we have to ask ourselves, what is Reconstruction? Now, as you go through your textbook, you'll find several issues popped up. People had questions about Reconstruction. Reconstruction, the act of putting the nation back together following the Civil War, meant different things to different people. For African Americans, obviously, it meant freedom. Now, there's a photograph from your book showing former slaves now at work on their own land. So for African Americans in the South, generally, the end of the Civil War meant freedom. It was also a time of political controversy. There was a great debate raging at the national level over whose role it was to oversee Reconstruction. Is it the role of the president? Is it the role of Congress? Is it the role of the Supreme Court? And this ended up in a impeachment, the first time we ever had an impeachment of a sitting U.S. president, with President Andrew Johnson being impeached. And so there are questions. This political cartoon from your book describes some of the issues that led to Johnson's impeachment. But there was also problems at the state and at the local level, too, as we went from a Confederate government back to a United States government. That meant that all the Confederates were now out of office, and we didn't deal with it as easily as most people would like to believe. There was a lot of disappointment and hardship as well, and this painting from your book shows this is a freedman, a former slave who now is free, but is being auctioned off because of debts that he owed. So, as I said earlier, there was freedom generally for African Americans, but many of them still lived in conditions very similar to those of slavery. There was also a time of political responsibility and citizenship. This from Harper's Weekly, called The First Vote, demonstrates various types of African Americans now that they had the franchise, the vote, and they're exercising it and how this would affect them politically and their decisions for the future. Also, a lot of poor whites in the South weren't allowed to vote before the Civil War either. The Civil War changed things for them as well. For the South, this is the period of the New South. Going hand in hand with the New South was a term we call the Lost Cause. Now, what was the Lost Cause? Well, it's this mythology of the Civil War. This image from your book of the unveiling of the statue, the monument to Robert E. Lee in Virginia, demonstrates this glorification of the Civil War and of the Old South that remained, even as Southerners were embracing the promise of a New South. This has really kind of come to fruition here at this program cover and the art from the Atlanta Exposition of 1895. I think this is very telling. I mean, here at the front you have the spirit of the New South coming. In her arms is a cornucopia of products from the South: tobacco, iron, steel, cotton, and other products that the South grew. Now you see the battlefield in front of you on the ruins of the Civil War, is that there was a new day dawning, a new South dawning, and they were going to put the past behind them. At the same time, they held on to the myth of the lost cause. So there were really two mindsets about the South following the Civil War. There was also Jim Crow segregation for a lot of African Americans, and this is the cover from the Supreme Court decision of Plessy versus Ferguson. It legalized Jim Crow segregation, which meant the policy of separate but equal. It was also a time for both poor whites and African Americans of the South of sharecropping and tenant farming. Now, we tend to look bad upon both and lump these two together. Actually, there were two different things. African American and poor white farmers who were sharecroppers were actually landowners. They were paying off their mortgage on the land by selling off part of the crops, which would then go to the landowner whom they were buying the land from. So sharecroppers were actually becoming landowners and farming for themselves. Tenant farmers, however, did not own the land they worked on. They were essentially agricultural labor. What happens and why this becomes bad is because fewer and fewer people become sharecroppers as they cannot keep up with payments, and more become simply workers on the land. There was also disenfranchisement of voters. This meant the vote was taken away through a variety of means that your textbook will cover, including the poll tax. This here is a receipt for a poll tax. Now, it doesn't look like it's very much. It's $2.50, $1.50 for the tax, and then other fees. In 1896, this was actually a lot of money. Most farmers only saw a few dollars a year. Most of their day-to-day business transactions were through trade. There just wasn't enough money. Money was in very limited supply, and so money was hard to come by. Asking for a poll tax several months in advance of the actual vote, and many people didn't pay it and were thus effectively denied the opportunity to vote. If we look at the next chapter, Conflict and Conquest, this focuses on Western expansion following the Civil War. The Transformation of the West is a subtitle, and here you see John Gast's portrait of the American Promise, showing the spirit of liberty moving westward, and as you see settlers and trains and steamships all coming out west, the Native Americans, the buffalo, wild animals are fleeing before the spread of civilization. One of the primary ways that we settled the West was through railroads. This picture from the Golden Spike at Promontory Point, Utah, where the Union Pacific and Southern Pacific rail lines joined together, symbolize the triumph of American unionism. The idea that both North and South were brought together. America, east to west, brought together, and there would be no more division, that we were moving forward. Railroads became the number one industry of the United States. They were the biggest business, and thus very well celebrated. There was a lot of diversity in the West, too, and part of this is with Native Americans. Now, your book has this painting called Buffalo Hunt on your left-hand side, but there were a lot of other people who were taking pictures and photographs and paintings and artwork of Native Americans, a lot of times because they feared that Native American culture was disappearing. This picture of Sioux chiefs taken by Edward Curtis demonstrates this kind of nobility of the Native Americans, again, because they believed that Native Americans as a people were dying out. Part of this was because they were selling a lot of land. The Dawes Severalty Act in 1875 took land away from Native Americans, privatized it, and began selling off additional reservation land to whites and other settlers. There were African Americans in the Deep South who saw more opportunity in the West. And these people who left the South were known as exodusters. And this artwork from the period that you see in your book demonstrates, here you have someone who's an ex-Union soldier and people waiting at the docks, waiting to go west, to go to Kansas, to take advantage of the Homestead Act and other land that was available. This made land very cheap and very available to a lot of people. And in the far left-hand corner, you have somebody escaping from the swamps in order to go west. This was their new escape to the west, away from the south. On the right-hand side, you see a picture of actual African-American settlers in the Kansas territories and other western territories. There were Asian immigrants in the West as well. This is a picture on the right-hand side from your book about a riot. Here you have Chinese miners being run out of a town in Wyoming. On the right-hand side, you have an actual photograph of Chinese miners in that same town. So there was violence associated, there was racism associated in the West, and there was a lot of diversity in the West. One of the statues that you see photographed in your book describes this kind of conflicted view we have of Native Americans that was becoming very popular in the 1890s. This was a statue made for Congress, to sit in Congress. It was eventually taken out because of its implications. Your book goes into great detail on how this represents the savage Indian, that white Americans and civilization was going to tame the Indian. This picture from the 1890s is from the Wounded Knee Massacre, where Indians were basically mowed down by the U.S. Army because the Army was afraid of the Indians, that they were leading a revolt and a rebellion. So this fear that, again, Native American society was on the brink of extinction. Also, buffalo hunting, and this photograph from your textbook illustrates this, is that millions of buffalo out on the plains were being killed by white hunters in order to make way for civilization and especially for railroads. And so this conflicting imagery we get, this picture also coming out of your textbook shows in 1876 that after the massacre of Custer's 7th Cavalry at the Battle of the Little Bighorn, that many Americans believed that Indians were half savage, half human, and that killing them wouldn't be a bad thing. Likewise, there was a lot of people who feared Asian immigrants. Here's a very stereotypical picture of a Chinese immigrant who seems to be taking jobs away from American youth. And you have the picture there of a policeman leading one young man who can't find work off to prison, off to jail. Other American children are sitting around idle, while you have a very overly industrious Chinese immigrant who's doing all sorts of work. And so again, this shows you the kind of fear that Americans had about immigrants who were taking their jobs. In Chapter 16, Wonder and Woe, The Rise of Industrial America, The chapter begins with a painting of a strike. And this was a time of many labor and workforce problems versus industry. And how do we resolve those? And you'll see this in the book. We look at the way the American economy was changing. Between 1860, at the beginning of the Civil War, to 1900, and the massive increases, the number of patents, there was a lot of research and development, the tremendous increase in the amount of oil, a tremendous increase in steel production, and tremendous increase in other economic indicators as well. As far as research and development, this was prompted and helped and assisted by a government dedication to laissez-faire capitalism. In other words, leave business alone. Some of the inventions, of course, from your book, you have Matt Zielger's lasting machine. This was a giant sewing machine that helped people sew the soles of your shoes to the body of your shoe. Metzlinger's machine made this automated. On the left-hand side, a very important invention. This is the drawing for Alexander Graham Bell's telephone. And of course, as I mentioned, this is a time of government. The government should keep their hands off of business. And here's another illustration that comes out of your book, The Slave of Liberty. And it shows American industry being shackled by taxes and being shackled by laws and other regulations, and how work, on the back side you see the shop that has writing on it where the work has come to a close, and the ship of America on the right-hand side is kind of broken down. This idea that we needed to let business alone and not tax them so that they could continue to do great things for America. And if we look at some of the reaction that Americans had to business, I think it's very telling. First of all, one thing that your book points out is the difference between vertical and horizontal integration. In these two ways, a lot of the capitalists of the late 19th century, what we call the Gilded Age, were seeking to combine to build bigger and stronger businesses and companies, either vertically or horizontally. And this gives you some idea of how this was done. This illustration does. And also in your book, you'll find out the capitalists who use these methods. Many use several methods. This led a lot of Americans to believe that the bosses of the Senate, the people really ruling Congress and the United States government, were the big corporations, whether it was Standard Oil or the Copper Trust or the Steel Trust or the sugar industry or coal, that they had bought and sold the federal government, and that the Senate bowed down for them. If you'll notice up at the top left-hand corner, the public entrance is barred and shut, while on the right-hand side, the entrance to Congress for monopolists, for big business, is wide open. There was also a fear of these corporations destroying America. This, you see the railroad monopoly shown as an octopus, devouring farmers and workers and the average person, threatening the ships, threatening government. So here people saw monopoly, some people saw monopoly as a bad thing. Other problems that were associated with the society at the time, some people were concerned about what this meant with these big businesses and how the small individual worker was being taken advantage of. It was almost as if they were unarmed. And here you have poor immigrant women working in sweatshops with cruel bosses. Their only relaxation at home, they lived in horrible homes. Policemen were breaking in, looking for people. They were coming off the ships as immigrants in rags, and they really weren't ever getting ahead or buying into the American dream. You also had a lot of child labor, and the idea that children were losing their youth because they were losing arms, legs, eyes, or even their lives working in factories caused a great deal of concern for a lot of people. And then the question is, how do you reform this? How do you change the society? So in Chapter 17, we look at becoming a modern society. In America in the Gilded Age, here, what does the Gilded Age mean? This was a term Mark Twain developed to say, there was a lot of shiny, golden opportunity, at least on the surface. Underneath, there was a lot of corruption. Gilded means plated, so it was gold-plated age. So you have the gold on the outside, and you have a baser metal on the inside. Let's look at some of the issues. European immigration increased tremendously. And if you look at the immigrants and where they're coming from, a lot more are coming from places like Russia, Italy, Ireland, Austria-Hungarian Empire, and other areas. They weren't traditional white Northern European immigrants. So you have a lot of different types of people coming into the United States. If you look at this map, and your book only shows you one block of this map, but this map shows the various immigrants and the various nationalities that were living in some of America's biggest cities. America's cities like New York, Boston, and Chicago were growing at tremendous rates because of the immigration. And you had many more people from many more places coming in, living side by side in this blended culture. Because of this, the cities, however, could not keep up. And so in this scene from New York, the streets were unpaved. A lot of these tenement houses were overcrowded. People were selling goods and whatnots on these busy, dirty, crowded streets. Horses were being used for transportation, of course. There were no automobiles this time. And so the horses going through the mud, some of them were dying and their bodies were just left until somebody could clean them up. There was a lot of fecal matter in the streets, and this was breeding disease. There were just a lot of problems in the cities because they grew with such rapidity. They were overcrowded and populated by a lot of poor people. This is a drawing for a tenement house. This shows you how these houses were, basically apartment buildings, were crammed together. The images that you see that look like crosses in the middle were very narrow wind tunnels. This was the only way that light and wind, air, was getting into the various floors in these multi-level apartment buildings. And as you can see from the floor plan layout here on the right-hand side, that they were very narrow houses that people lived in, very homes that people lived in these apartments. A couple of bedrooms, maybe one bedroom, a kitchen, and a living room. And that was about it. So this was built to house many, many people who weren't paying, who couldn't afford to pay very much, but charging them as much as they could afford. Because of this, because of the overcrowding, because of the lack of opportunity, because of poor wages, there was a tendency for people to turn to politicians who would do things for them. This idea wouldn't go in America today so much because we have a lot of laws and regulations, a safety net to protect people. In those days, there wasn't one. So it was the local politician, the political boss, as they called him, like Boss Tweed, who took care of individuals, all of these immigrants coming into the cities, not only from Europe and overseas, but also from South America, from the American South, from Asia. Various political bosses controlled the votes because of the services they provided in their areas. If you were a poor immigrant or a poor migrant to a big city, who is going to take care of you? The political boss. What did he ask in return? Your vote. And you wanted to keep him in because he was where you turned for help. So those are some of the problems. Now, there were also other problems that resulted from the mass immigration. One of those is nativism. This is an idea that America should be for Americans. One way, and this is again an illustration from your book, is this picture of Uncle Sam, turning up his nose, holding his nose at the sight and at the smell of these poor, dirty immigrants coming into the United States. Here they have an immigrant, very stereotypical representation. They don't respect our Sabbath, our holy days. They bring in anarchy. They bring in liquor. And America, just walk on in. America the free. This welcome sign, you have Uncle Sam standing at the gate. preventing these poor wretches from coming in with their disease and their poverty. That was one attitude that many people had. Another attitude, the way the attitude manifests itself is in patriotism. And here you have some children, many from various different countries and nationalities, all learning how to say the Pledge of Allegiance and salute the flag. Although you notice their salute doesn't look like the salute we have today. But they're learning how to salute and dedicate their honor and their lives to the nation, to become U.S. citizens. At the same time, in the Midwest and in the South, you had a challenge to society. This was called the Populist or the People's Party. The Populist Party was a kind of a hodgepodge of various groups that were complaining about how American society had degenerated in the Gilded Age. Some of these were unions, like the Knights of Labor. Others were political parties, like the Grangers and the Socialists and the Greenback Party. Farmers, people who supported prohibition, ending alcohol, people who wanted more money to be in circulation, the Free Silver Party and the Greenbackers. All of these groups were tied together, and as this cartoon makes fun of them, into a platform of lunacy. So not everybody was crazy about the Populist Party or the People's Party, but they did run two major elections. And in that, William Jennings Bryan from Nebraska was their presidential candidate. Although he was never elected, he did run for many political offices and will become important later on in American history. If we look at Chapter 18, Creating a Democratic Paradise, we look at the Progressive Era, 1895 to 1915. During this period, this was a time of reform, and this idea of progressive reform manifested itself in various ways. One, this fear of powerful business interests. John D. Rockefeller had made his career off of oil refining, and so Standard Oil, again, is tied to this image of the octopus that's devouring Congress and the United States and the White House and hurting American business and people and trade and industry. And so many people began trying to limit the power of these great national corporations. There was also concern at a more local level, and that was of child labor. Here you have a young girl inside of a textile mill, and the question of children working was addressed. Many of the progressives sought to implement laws that would change this. You also had people who wanted to change society and change morality. This is Carrie Nation. She made a name for herself, very popular figure, going around with her little axe, bashing in liquor stores and bashing in liquor barrels, cutting them up so that people wouldn't drink. She believed in prohibition. You also had people who were at reforming business, but not in getting rid of business, but in making business more efficient. This is a picture from Henry Ford's assembly line. Here you have workers assembling a Ford automobile, and this idea of efficiency. Let's not waste, that we can make workers work more efficiently, more cheaply, and produce a better product, a uniform product that was reliable. And so efficiency was an important reform. For African Americans, there was what W.E.B. Du Bois called the problem of the color line. And this image from your book of Hampton's students portrays the image that, even though these African American students were getting higher education, were in college and university, the main emphasis and what people really respected out of this was that they were learning trades and skills, not just education for education's sake. And so this idea that an educated African American was one who knew how to put his hands to use in a skill, not so much for learning, really reinforces one of the problems that African Americans faced, that they weren't respected for their education. You also had leaders who represent two distinct differences in what we might call racial uplift. One was Booker T. Washington, who was a Southern educator who encouraged that African Americans learn vocational skills and training. Another was W.E.B. Du Bois. Du Bois was from the North, the first PhD from Harvard University in sociology. His family had never been slaves, unlike Booker T. Washington, and he came with a much different mindset. He, although had gone to school in the South and in the North, he said that African Americans needed to fight for equality and not just for what the whites expected them to do, like Booker T. Washington, like he accused Booker T. Washington of doing. So there was a great debate between racial uplift. If we look at this entire unit and kind of the overview of the unit that I provided, we can begin to answer the unit question. Now, there are some things to keep in mind when you're looking at the unit question, and so let's kind of go over these things so that you'll have some idea of what I'm looking for. Make sure that you connect the sources I've provided to the text. It's not enough, and in fact, it's not the assignment to simply describe the sources. You need to show how the sources illustrate the text, how the text backs up the sources and provides context for the sources and helps the sources to make sense. Make sure that you answer the question. That is your thesis statement. In any paragraph, any paper that you write, your thesis statement is the most important thing. It tells the reader where you're going in the essay, and you need to support your thesis statement with evidence, which you're going to get from the book. You need to use at least 3 of the sources. You need to make sure that you write an introduction and a conclusion, telling me, as the reader, what you're going to talk about, why you answered the question the way you answered the question, and then in your conclusion, you want to reinforce that. And finally, the most important 2 tips I can give you, make sure that you review the paper guidelines and review the grading rubric. That's how you're going to be assessed for your unit assignment. And finally, make sure that you do your own work. You're turning this in via Turnitin. That means I'm checking to make sure that this is your own work in your own words and that you're not turning in somebody else's work and passing it off as your own. And as a university faculty, we're committed to teaching you how to think and write and reason on your own. And so that's why this is very important. The university has an academic honesty code. This is covered in your syllabus. Please review it. And so these are ways that you can do well in this first unit, Rebuilding the Nation. Thank you for your time and good luck on your unit assignment.